evening. It's lovely to see you all here. There are a few seats down the front still on this wonderfully comfortable bench, so I'm afraid the late comers have to suffer the hard surface. But thanks everyone for turning up. It's lovely to be here with Azara and Shamil for this discussion this evening. We sort of hope this will be an interactive session as well, and hopefully some interesting things will come out of it. So any recollections people have of key figures from the time, please do sort of raise that at the end. Azara is obviously publishes ARTRA, what has become an extremely important journal in Sri Lanka and South Asia as a whole, and is doing very good work documenting contemporary and modern art scene in the region. And I think one of the most important things is interviewing some of these characters that either aren't with us anymore, or whose experiences sort of need to be preserved for posterity. So she's doing great work, and long may that continue. So Azara's going to introduce sort of what we're going through this evening, and then we're sort of off to the races, and we'll have a little question and answer at the end.
Thanks, Charlie, for your very generous words. Thank you for having us in this talk. And of course, all of you know Charlie, context has been given already. And then we've got Dr. Shamil Wanigaratne, who has flown from Dubai for this talk, which we're very grateful for. He has also authored the monographs of George Clason and Montessori, which came out in 2020 and 2021, I believe. And is also... Oh, sorry. Yes, and also is a psychologist in profession, and has documented very important works, and those are the modernists specifically. And today we thought we're going to shed a bit more light on what characterizes Sri Lankan modern art, and also delve into its influences within the soil and also outside, and also to give a larger context to why we're discussing it at this point in time. So, because Sri Lankan modernism, of course, is defined by the periods of, I would say, 1900s to 1920s, I believe. That's when it all burgeoned in the stylistic sense and went on till about 1967, I would say. And so it's, of course, a bygone period, but I think it's also important for us to understand why there's a relevance to discuss about it now. So in that sense, we thought Shamil should perhaps shed light to some of the critical components.
I'm shedding light, but share a few ideas. First of all, my disclaimer, I'm not an art historian, and that's going to upset Wolf, but I'm a psychologist who has a very healthy interest in art, I think, or unhealthy. The last time I tried to combine my two passions, art and psychology, in a talk, I got fired as a professor of clinical psychology at United Arab Emirates University, but there was a symposium on madness, or insanity and creativity, but we don't go there, but that's another story. But I am particularly passionate about the modern art of the 43 group because in my childhood I knew George Key. Then I worked with George Clason for 5 years writing his monograph, and I have met Richard Gabriel from at least 3 43 group artists, and my interest stems from that. To bring things into the current context, the movement to decolonize museums and art institutions in the Western world countries has injected a lot of energy, I think, into the art world, the Asian art world. Not just South Asian, but Asian art in general, I think. And the economic axis shifting from west to east has also, I think, contributed to this energy. So it's a very interesting period. This renewed interest in Asian art also goes to the modern period, not just contemporary. So that's the kind of context. The 43 group, I think, they're pioneers when it comes to Southeast Asia in terms of modern art. I think that can't be overstated. And looking at the history of, how shall I say, their contribution in this, coming from this very small country, I think they have punched way above their weight. And doing this, preparing for this talk, I just realized how much work has happened globally with their work. Definitely, the title, the exam question sent to me by Azara was influence beyond the shows, and we certainly, I would say yes, we have. I think.
And if I am to even stop, recently the Grosvenor Gallery had the Ivan Pieces exhibition from David Coates' collection that took place in March, of which we have 2 of them.
There's a couple, yeah. I mean, our focus here at the gallery is South Asian modern and contemporary works of art predominantly. And we wanted to do an Ivan period show for the longest time, but like so many of these artists, the material is so hard to come by. And we were very fortunate this time last year to come across this amazing collection of work by Bill's, owned by a friend of his who met in Oxford in the 60s. And he, there's more work to be done with that collection as well. There's letters going back and forth between the 2 of them that he's kept, and wonderful documents from the period, and it's really, these things sometimes come out of nowhere, and they really can be fascinating. And he fits in well with a lot of the other artists who came to the UK from the Commonwealth that we work with, the sort of main one being Francis Newton Sousa. But also they're all tied together really by Rashid Araim, a Pakistani British artist, who actually made the bench that you're sitting on there at the front. But we'll come on to that in a bit. But,
And I'd like to add to that as well, just before your exhibition, beginning of this year and end of last year, at the Highgate Gallery, Irina is here. We had a very successful George Claassen exhibition, and so there are 2 examples of recent time. And so we will go into those later. But so there's energy right now, and very soon I think there's going to be a film coming out on George Claassen, and that will be a first after a long time, I think. After Line of Men, but apparently there was a film made on LTP Manjushri, but we can't find any copies of it. But so that essentially, it's an exciting time. But I think the Sri Lankan modernist contribution is yet to be recognized, and that's the theme that we would kind of develop during this talk.
Because it's interesting that even though we are out of Sri Lanka, we have places outside that are showcasing this modernist consistency. So I think it is important for us to also understand that simultaneously these exhibitions and importance kind of add more weight to what the 43 group mean in today's context. And I think it would be interesting to also define the period in which they emerged, because it was during the 1920s, 30s. There was an evolving civilization in Sri Lanka taking place as a result of the rise of the middle class. The economy was doing quite well, and then you had the pre-modernists in that period who were very instrumental in promoting the naturalist tradition. So you had the Doyen A.G.S.C. Amarsekara, who very vehemently in a debate, in fact, with Lionel Went, stood forth for a conformist perspective, which Lionel Went at that point, who is one of the founding members and a key steering artist of the 43 group movement, who contested it, because this group, although they started collectively showcasing in 1943, from 1920 and 1930 they've been having individual exhibitions at the National Art Gallery. And they challenged this, the national tradition of the Royal Academy at the time that was being promoted by the Ceylon Society of Arts Club, by renewed constructs of style, technique and subject matters. So then it becomes very interesting, because here emerges a set of works by Lionel Wendt, the photographs of which we have gone quite in detail in the Lionel Wendt edition of ARTRA magazine that celebrates the human form, spirit, and the ancient heritage through the Ambaka, and he goes through quite a bit, and even from Gampala, beautiful, scenes of the dark skin, and then you'd have very critical perspectives of Aubrey Collett, whose sheer mockery of the political figures of the time sort of takes on an element that brings in a bit of questioning and probing, because the 43 group is also sometimes considered to be very idyllic in their presentation, but in fact they certainly presented a revolt against the status quo at the time. And in fact, in one of the interviews that we had for the 43 group edition, I was speaking to Shanathanan, who is the head of the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Jaffna, during which he said that it was very interesting that in this period when most of the works by the Indian artists and that of the Pakistani, their work kind of revolved around political propaganda for the independence, but then the Sri Lankan artists, the 43 group, kind of had their own agenda. I guess it also helps that we didn't have to fight too much for independence. It was kind of given as a result of India and Pakistan also receiving it. But it's interesting that in this time period, their work were very characteristic of their own visual agendas. And in fact, you have the works of Ivan Piris here, which is very romantic and lyrical in poetry from a visual motive kind of sense. So this is more or less, perhaps, would you like to add an extra element, maybe a plaza?
Yeah, we'll get to that, but I think the context, but the period is, the modern period is certainly not what we call it the modern period, because Sri Lanka was a bit late to discover modernism, I think 30, 40 years after, and it was started by a British art teacher called Charles Freegrove Windsor in the 1920s, and that gave birth to the 43 group and a whole host of modern artists and the schools and the clubs that from there. But so Siva, Nathan Siva, some of you believe to him, and quite a few people here knew him, has a very precise definition. It's 1920 to 1967 was the modern period, and he also calls it the classical period. And he and I have had many arguments that you can't call it the classical period, but Siva stuck to that. But 67 is when the 43 group had its last exhibition. For Siva, that was the end of modernism. But so the definition is arbitrary, but it's the period that we're talking about. And we'll go to David Painter in a minute just to put that question.
And in fact, since you brought in C.F. Windsor, he clearly was a very catalytic figure of the time, because it's interesting that he was appointed the art inspector in 1921. And after which there was even a Windsor Art Club that was started by Kanagasabe, who's part of the peripheries, because when it comes to Sri Lankan modernism, everyone thinks of the 43 group, but then there are these other characters around, as in the other artists rather. And C.F. Windsor was interesting because if you look at that trail, you had in 1938 the Ceylon Art Club was the Ceylon Art Club, which Windsor formed as a contrast mainly to the Ceylon Society of Arts that was started off by A.G.S. Yamara.
Which was the establishment.
Yes, it was the established norm at the time. And then you have in 1938 the Windsor Club that promoted the education of art in a non-conformist sense, after which the 1943 group emerges. So you have this interesting trail that the modernism kind of revolved around with this catalytic figure. I just thought I'll add that in.
To that, and maybe I'll take that opportunity to just put the question about David Painter. David Painter was an artist who was born the same year as Lionel Wendt. He got a scholarship to come to the Royal Academy, and he probably was the first Sri Lankan to study at the Royal Academy and have the word letters RA behind its name. And he won a gold medal while he was a student at the Royal Academy. He went back and he was largely seen as a very academician, so he belonged to the ACG, Samarsekara. But the fact that he had a parallel existence to Lionel Wendays, I couldn't find any evidence of any conversations, whether he was invited to be part of the 43 group or anything like that. Whereas Professor Albert Dharmasiri says that, and I agree with him, when you look at his work, there are elements of Impressionism, Modernism, and a lot of modern aspects to his work. And he unashamedly was a classical theoretician, he stuck to the establishment. But I think there is a lot in Painter's work that needs to be looked at, and about him as well. There's very little written about David Painter. And he died, not that long after Lionel went, and that's 1974, I think. So it's just a question, and if anybody here who knows anything about David Painter or has some information about it, I would love to hear, because I think it's a question mark. Why was he just not?
Certainly, I will have.
Yeah, David.
There's just one little thing, which I think very few people are aware of. There is a beautiful David Painter painting in the Brighton Museum. How it got there, I don't know. And it's almost ignored, but it's there. It's a very beautiful painting.
And his work does have a touch of modernism. It's not
Sure.
classical, natural painting. So anyway, that's a question I'm going to explore. Sorry.
And we also thought we'll highlight another interesting component, because the 43 group, like I said, kind of dominates Sri Lankan modernism as a style. And there are periphery artists. But at the same time, there were significant female artists who in fact showcased alongside the 43 group, and they were invited by them. So I thought it would be interesting, because Nalini Vijay Nayaka, who is very interestingly Senaka Senanayaka's mother, her work was showcased at the very first at Darley Road, I believe in 1943. And then we had Susan Foster Green, Edith, and of which we have Sybil Keith's collections, and also Sita Kulasekara and some Swani Jayawardana's at the Sabumal Foundation. So it's something that we have also been now starting to explore, because I think it has not been given due credit. So it's very interesting for us to sort of and we're very excited to explore it further, because some of these works are in private collections, because I think the granddaughter of Swani Jayawardene is here. In fact, just a few days ago we were having a conversation on the collections, where they are, and what they're like, and the narrative. So there's a lot of interesting underpinnings as well to Sri Lankan modernism, which will probably be some new insight that we can shed light to. Is there anything else that perhaps, because I think Shamil, you did mention that you were familiar with some of the works of these artists. Sybil Keith, is it?
Yeah, well, there's a point that some of them were married to 43 artists, so they were eclipsed. So Sybil was married to Neville Veeratne, and Sita Kulasekara to Richard Gabriel. So that was a very that you don't hear otherwise. Yeah.
And also, I think we touched on this, but Farid Uduman is another very interesting artist. He had very flamboyant bodies, deformed bodies were ones that he focused on. It was very interesting, we thought, because he's also a Muslim artist, and from the time he was very much controversial in his content, but at the same time he had his own interpretation with religion, because he was also the artist whose family donated the land for the Jawata Mosque, which is one of the most important mosques in Colombo. So this is another alternative narrative that could be read. He was not a part of the 43 group, but
he spans the time scale, isn't it? Because
yes,
I would call him a postmodernist, but he's
very much a modernist.
in that time scale.
And in fact, Ellen Dissanayake also discusses the works of Justin Deniaka, who was a part of the 43 group, and those of Farid Uduman. So it's an interesting analysis.
And anybody who is interested or goes to Sri Lanka, you can visit his son, Joe Monduman has created a gallery called the Sky Gallery, where there is a permanent collection of Farid's work. So real Sky Gallery because there's a big staircase to climb, but apparently they're going to fix a lift there. But yeah, Farid's work is very interesting, I think, in terms of modernism. Okay, just a bit of, yeah, this is another point to move, and I think it's put very nicely by the curator, the director of the museum that hosted a Land of Land exhibition in Japan. If I can read from here, in Japan, Sri Lanka is only famous for tea, resort and Buddhist temples. However, we would be very grateful if people who see this exhibition can get familiar with the Sri Lankan culture that has cosmopolitan possibilities as a cross point of the Western and Eastern culture. I think that is the key point, and with the 43 group and the Modernist, this cross point. And it's put again by Sir William Rotherstein, who wrote a recommendation letter to Harry Pearis, one of the artists of the 43 group, recommending him to teach at Shantiniketan Tagore School, and says, I don't think that if you want anyone to help you to serve as a link between Eastern and Western art, you could get a better man. And that was written in 1930. So the point making is that I think Sri Lanka, or the Sri Lankan modernists, have also functioned as a kind of a, fusion is a bad word, but a crossroad or an interface between Western art, Western modern art, and Eastern art. So it's a point I think you people here might have opinions on it. But I think the function of the 43 group and modernists was such.
Well, certainly, like many of these artists, many of the artists from South Asia, further afield, all around the world, Europe was sort of a temple of modernism, wasn't it? And everyone sort of had to do their pilgrimage to Paris and see the great masters' works, and because you have to remember that a lot of these artists, looking at reference material, only had reproductions or prints or engravings that they were looking at. So to obviously go and stand in front of stand in these great museums and see this work was hugely inspirational. And then of course they come back to their home countries and assimilate what they've seen and with their sort of local narratives, local stories, local folk tales, and that's how how modernism sort of spread around the world. And really now it's quite interesting that this year the Venice Biennale, the main exhibition there is looking at, it's called Foreigners Everywhere, and it is looking at modernism from around the world. So there's work by George Keaton in the show, for example, but then there's also paintings by Pakistani, Indian, Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Turkish. These centres where people don't automatically think of as being cultural centres or hubs for creativity in the mid-century, but through their exposure to culture, not only in Europe but also at home, you have these amazing the artists come from everywhere.
And also, I think the role that the 43 Sapma Foundation plays in that sense in Colombo is imperative to keeping the spirit of the 43 group alive, because it was Harry Pearis's home, and Harry Pearis is secretary of the 43 group, and we have a grandniece here again, who sort of maintained a sense of honesty in the way in which it was presented, because he was an artist who collected the works of his peers, showcased it at his home, and now you have the trust taking on that role of, having a public collection. There's an authenticity in the voice in which it's presented.
To get to your point again, George Keat was criticized, or critics look at it that he was trying to fuse, and there's a lot of Picasso in it, or influenced by Picasso. I don't want to go into that debate, but I think Asudhara Dalmia in her book From Buddha to Krishna, I think covers that very nicely. George Clason, on the other hand, his work, and here's an example, there is no East-West fusion here. It is, I think, modern, and the colours may be from the East. And I don't know, Esme, sorry to put you in the spot, but George, there's not much in George's work that is kind of East meets West. I think he's exploring new territory in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to?
Yes, I would agree with you, really. I don't know exactly what he was exploring, but I think he was looking for something in the abstracts, you know, trying to find some sort of answers to things that he was interested in at the time.
Well, I mean, really, none of these artists are working to be, you know, they're all working to produce something new. They're working to be innovative and to you know, no one is looking at something trying to copy it and trot out an example of it. They're all, certainly the ones who sort of went through, struggle to make it to India or the UK or, you know, wherever they ended up. None of these guys, or none of these artists are doing it for fun of it. They're trying to put their narrative out there.
Being creative.
Should we sort of, because I'm mindful that there's a lot of slides left.
Yes, I think let's get into the visuals. I think they're more interesting. So,
Yeah, we can
would you
show
like to
it.
go with?
There's a great picture of Martin Russell because, of course, you know, there's so many important
Charlie, it
intellectuals.
might be good to just cover that slide very quickly, the one before that, because we have to mention Martin Russell, who I think more than anybody has done a lot of work to promote the Sri Lankan modernists in the West, particularly in the UK, but in Europe as well. And his work was, I think, phenomenal. I think he met George Keat in 1943, and till Martin died in 2003, he was fully engaged in promoting his book. And if you look at the tens of exhibitions that has happened here, there's a slide that his contribution has to be acknowledged. And I think again what we need is people like Martin Russell to push this agenda forward right now, because that isn't there. And then Sivasambu, as I mentioned, worked with Martin. He was a total enthusiast of this period, and his contribution. This book, Siva put together, but it wasn't completed, and we just got 2 more copies. And the graphic designer Sanat is here, who has. I hope you have it, but I know you lost much of the work. But this is a piece of work that needs to be published and completed. But it needs a lot of work and it needs a lot of editing. So Siva's book has to be mentioned, and these are pages from Siva's book. So you can, and this is Siva. This is Martin, and that's the front cover of the book as Sanat.
This is in Supplemal, isn't it? The chess players.
Chess players in Supplemal, and that's the young Martin. This is Nathan Sivasambu, some of whom you know and love and argue with, but this is his baby, and it's a pity that unfortunately Siva had a problem that he could never finish things. He didn't finish his PhD, he didn't finish this book, but this was going to be his piece of contribution, and I'm very keen to push this forward. Also talking about Martin Russell, the book on the left here was the first ever sort of monograph of an Asian artist. This book on George Keat, written in 1950, was the first. Now of course there's lots of books on the 43 group and others, but this was the first for an Asian artist. So again, Martin's contribution.
Lots of books, but all of them very hard to get hold of. You know, these things. The one on Ivan Pires, we borrowed one for the research for the show. You can't buy it for love of money. You know, they are. You know, these things are available in libraries, but it's not like you can pop round the corner and research them. And that is a bit of an issue. You know, there are great things like the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong that are archiving all this information, but it's not a lot of it is freely accessible.
These are the 43 group and Justin Dharanigala and Richard Gabriel, examples of their work.
Keats.
These are Keats, yeah. Ivan Pires, all Ivan Pires, I think, yeah. This is Lionel Wendt, of course, and his kind of very almost private pictures of George Keat. They were very close friends. and I think Lionel encouraged George to take up painting, and I think they were very, and Lionel's death had a huge impact on Keith and the 43 group, but so they're very private photos of George Keith. I think when I knew George Keith, he was a pompous old man, and he was very, talked not about himself, but these were very, very subtle, very sensitive photographs of George Keith.
And this, in fact, is Collett's
Okay.
rotund
Okay.
Lionel went.
Yeah.
So there's quite a bit of caricatures.
Yeah,
and-
well, yeah, he was like that.
He
wasn't
certainly
He captured
was,
that,
yeah.
So, these are some of George Claeson's pieces. And okay, we need to say a little bit about, some of you might have been members of the 43 group, Colombo, London, or Bloomsbury, London, or whatever, Bloomsbury, Colombo. This is Siva, Martin Russell and Siva and Ranjit Fernando, who's another enthusiast artist, had a small group, formed a small group to promote the Sri Lankan modernists, particularly the 43 group, and they were responsible for the exhibitions in 1952, 54, then on, and finally I think in 1987 at the Lyre Room. So, so Ranjit Fernando and Siva. So Siva had this, I think, Rumi, I don't know whether you were part of this as well, you would have been roped in. I was shocked when I realized I was put down as treasurer or something, which I didn't realize. But so he really tried to keep recruiting younger people, trying to keep this agenda, this interest going, and maybe we should provide this 43 group for London at some point. At the
And in
Grosvenor
fact, the
Gallery.
very first overseas exhibition of 43 group was at the Imperial Institute here in London.
And we actually we found a in sort of doing with the research for the show. We found an image. The one top left is the is an image of Justin Derridango's work at that show in 1952, and it's part of this sort of the early overseas exhibitions that the 43 group had. I love that the graphic designer for the show at Pretty Pele obviously did their Venice Biennale catalogues as well. They just ripped off the font for the next ones. But
There you go, Salah.
And the following exhibition was at the Heifer Gallery in Cambridge.
yeah.
After Petit Palais.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not so often the case with many of these artists, and you know, that really in the sort of 1950s in London, there were so many small galleries with very focused schedules of exhibitions, focused, but then also very avant-garde. You know, so these artists, they came, and a lot of them had success, and they were able to show fairly widely around the UK. And there was a sort of very strong network, and you know, you've got to remember this is only 7-8 years after the war finished. So you know, London's still full of holes, and you know, some of the streets haven't been cleared away, and you know, it was still in rationing. You know, rationing would be in place for quite a few years after that show took place. So it was really. It wasn't necessarily the easiest place to be an artist, but there was excitement, and there was a sort of new dawn after the war, and excitement of you know, these artists coming from overseas and bringing colours and ideas and exotic ideals and ways of thinking with them, which would have chimed with the population here. And you can see why so many galleries offered these artists shows. You know, this is just the inside of the catalogue for Venice. In 57 island periods of Richard Gabriel, and you know, there were lots of Shamil sort of put together a list of lots of these early shows, and you know, really so many of these institutions and museum galleries don't exist anymore. You know, their archives are out there. Many of them are in the Tate Library, so you can go and visit these places and go through the old documents and pull out information that's kind of hiding in plain sight, that is there, that often just languishes, and people often.
I was amazed at the volume of shows.
Yeah, I mean,
and there's another slide, I think, which I mean, these two slides just cover, probably not comprehensive, exhibitions in UK alone, and that's quite a lot, I think, in many ways. while we're in this slide, I'd also like to kind of, so 8 is this Ceylon Bloomsbury group, and then the 43 group, Colombo London. Those are the two names I was looking for that Siva and Martin Russell orchestrated. So, and also Siva organized quite a few seminars and symposia on the modernist group. Some of you might have attended these. So in 1999, illustrated lecture on Ivan Pires, and Professor Seneca Bandanayake came and gave a talk on it. Then for the George Clason book launch in the year 2000, we had a symposium which is very well attended, and then a Martin Russell commemoration event in 2008, and that's where this book was, the dummy of the book was presented to Martin's wife, and that was quite an important event as
And
well.
in fact, many of these exhibitions were also organized by Ranjit Fernando
Yeah, Ranjit was there.
from
Yeah.
Harry Pierce's family, because he was based here and he himself was
Artist.
quite alien,
Alien, but also an artist.
But with the help of an Englishman, William Graham, who was his dear friend, they were one of the key figures to make sure that the portrait and their works were also showcased overseas.
And I think after
Besides
Ranjit
Martin.
left, Siva took over more or
Yeah.
less, but Ranjit was also a very key player in all this. And he wanted an alternative history of the 43 group written, and sent me some material, but looked at it. We failed to mention Minet de Silva, which I think is a very important person as well, and I think Seneca, I don't know whether you're here, Seneca organized a symposium not that long ago at the Royal Academy. Yeah. India, it's our closest neighbor, and everybody would argue that a lot of the Sri Lankan culture has come from India, but it hasn't been, and when it comes to the modernists, it hasn't been a one-way street, it has been a two-way street. And the Sri Lankan modernists have influenced the Indian modernists. Yasudhara Dalmia really covers this really well, and particularly George Keat had a huge influence on N.F. Hussain, Haider Raza, and Newton Sousa, and Mulkra Janan, who was also another key player promoting George Keat, as well as, of course, they established Mark, the magazine, just 1 year after the Asian Archives. No, not even 1 year, a few months after Asian Archives in 1946. And the first issue carried an article on George Keat, the second issue on Lionel Wen, and Minet de Silva was one of the founding members of MARC as an architect. And her sister, Anil, then edited MARC for a few years and was in a partnership with Moore. But MARC is still one of the key art magazines, and Sri Lanka had to wait another 60 years to get ARTRA 10 years ago. Somewhere, since then India had the energy and the power and the volume and to take this agenda forward, but we also have contributed to that journey. I think that's the point I was going to make. And these are the exhibitions and things. Interesting thing, in 1936, I think, David Painter had an exhibition in India, and he also exhibited at the Wertheimer Gallery in London, which at the time was supposed to be one of those radical galleries that stood against the establishment. And if he was such a classicist, then why was he invited to exhibit there? And since then he, I think, had exhibitions in a few countries. And Wertheimer Gallery was a gallery that promoted people like Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. So somewhere I feel that David Painter's role and contribution has been kind of forgotten. But anyway, so India, there's been a few exhibitions. This is not comprehensive, but that's another country. And I think
Europe as well, just
Europe,
quick look at
yeah. I think Charlie, you have something to say about Europe.
Well, I mean, just going back to the importance of all these exhibitions that were happening, around the UK. This is from 1954, AIA gallery, and several of these show shows were well reviewed in the press, and they were well attended and well covered, and the artists were making sales, and it just meant that other galleries took an interest. This is material relevant to the New Vision Centre, which was a gallery that dealt in abstract art. George Claassen showed with them, and again, only in operation for a small period of time in the 50s and early 60s, but they contributed massively to the landscape of British art in the 20th century. And I think that's what we sort of need to remember with these artists as well, is that they are important not just to Sri Lanka and South Asia, but they're important to Britain and
World history of art.
And yeah, exactly, a history of art in this country at that time, because they are they're part of the conversation, and they are pushing things forward, and they are a lot of these artists are sort of are really doing avant-garde work in the UK at that time. Again, here this is the Heffer Gallery. Heffer's a bookshop in Cambridge, bizarrely, so I didn't even know they had a gallery, even though I grew up there. And then we've got things like artist circles and the Free Painters Association, which was set up by a very eclectic group of artists. Francis Newton Sousa was a prominent member. George Claassen was, and showed with them in Hampstead. I think you can see there on the right. And there's a lot of important artists that are part of that group. So not only did many of these artists contribute artistically, but they were moving in very important circles, and exchanging ideas on an academic level as well as on a sort of artistic level. And then you've got a great photo on the left of Seneca Bandanaike and Ivan Perez at his show in the 60s. Again, one of these small galleries which is no longer here, but which played an interesting role in development. Again, it's not just in London as well. They're an important institution outside of London is a gallery called Bear Lane Gallery in Oxford. And they had several shows of South Asian artists' works in the 60s. Francis Newton Sousa, Tired Mehta had one of his first shows in the UK there in 1961. Ivan Perez had a show there. There was an exhibition of South Asian art, this is the catalogue for. And they're an important gallery that is showing a lot of these artists' works. George Butcher, who's mentioned on the front cover of the catalogue there, he's another individual who plays an important role in promoting all of these artists. He was the arts critic for The Guardian, and had a strong connection to the region and supported these shows and helped to organise a lot of them. So this was a show that happened in 1961, and then you have other individuals like David Coates, who owned the collection of Ivan Perez, which we showed in spring. He met Ivan at university when Seneca Bandanaike was at Oxford in the 60s. He met David Coates and they became friends, and he came up to London to see a show of Ivan's, and then they suggested putting on an exhibition in Oxford, a sort of mini retrospective, which is the catalogue on the left. So it's sort of all these sort of small things build up to contribute towards the development of his career in particular. Obviously, I'm quite in the detail of Ivan Perez at the moment, because we've just done that show. And then, again, the one on the right was an exhibition held in the late 70s. Again, this is just some press materials. I mean, you kill these days for written press like this for any exhibition, but so it's fantastic that all these shows were really well supported and well covered. Yeah. And in another, it's sort of patronage. Martin Russell was a great early patron of so many of these artists, and for a lot of the loan exhibitions, next to all the Keats and Ivan Perez, it says collection Martin Russell, collection Martin Russell. But from Bear Lane Gallery, the Oxford colleges were good buyers as well. So this work was part we had on loan for our exhibition, and that was from I just put Oxford College, that's not right, from Pembroke College in Oxford. And what the colleges would often do is they had this scheme where an undergraduate could bid in an auction. They had an auction every year, and you could put your name down for something, and then pay £5 or whatever it is, and you have the right to display a work of art in your rooms for the year. And this was one of those pictures, and actually it's in surprisingly good condition, considering it's been in a student's bedroom for years. But one of the worst ones was I went to a college and they had this lovely Tired Meta 60s painting of a horse, and I sort of went with the hope that they might want to sell it, but this lady pulled it out of the racks, and it was covered in, there was sort of wine splashes all over it. There was not quite cigarette burns in it, but it wasn't far off, and they had it, often these things, they never get insured for their rightful value, because also what you have to remember is that the commercial value of a lot of this material is far higher than it has ever been, and you hear stories from, modern British dealers who were, going down Portobello Road in the 80s and 90s, and they were buying things for, ridiculous sums of money. And so often, if something enters a collection, an Oxford College collection, things would be, criminally underinsured. I think they had this one in their books of £500, so we had to sort of tell them, notch it up a bit.
Just to add to that point, I remember Martin Russell saying that when Ivan Peters, one of the paintings was sold at Sotheby's, and it fetched a very reasonable, not a very high price. Martin said, I don't think Ivan earned that much money in his entire lifetime.
Wow.
So, and he gave a lot of paintings away as well, let alone sell. So.
Well, I think certainly something that we've encountered with the Ivan period shows, there were a lot of patrons, and there were a lot of good friends that supported him throughout his career. And he did have a period of, he had struggles with his mental health for a long time, and there were people, like David Coates, who would go and they, give him an amount of money, and he'd be sent home with some paintings or a sketchbook, and that just sort of continued as the years went on. So these individuals are really key to the success of a lot of these artists and their sort of survival, really, on a day-to-day basis. Another interesting institution that I thought it would be quite interesting to mention was the Commonwealth Institute Art Gallery. And this building was constructed in the early 60s and completed in 1962. And this replaced the Imperial Institute, which held the first exhibition of the 42 group in the 50s. And it's an amazing building. The Design Museum is housed in there now, so it's a building you can still go and visit. It was empty for many, many years, but in the 60s they had a curator called Donald Bowen, who put together some fantastic shows of artists from South Asia and all over the Commonwealth, basically. But they had a big exhibition of Sri Lankan modernism, mixed group show in 1964, and there are, again, if you see under George Keat on the left, collection of Martin Russell, there's a lot of works that were loaned from him. This work behind me here, Ivan Peary's, that's on there, number 41, and work by George Carson. So a lot of these artists were sort of represented in that exhibition. And this is an exhibition of Ivan Peary's from 1966 at the Commonwealth Institute. And both of these two paintings here were in that exhibition. So this is the first time they've been sort of reunited since then, basically, which is rather a nice thing. And it's quite, this image on the right is from the Tate archive, so they have the archive of the Commonwealth Institute Gallery. And it's very handily priced up. And what's quite interesting to note about this picture here, which is called albizzias, which is a type of, I can't remember, silk plant, I think it's called, is it's, I think, the fourth most expensive picture in that show, after some really important seminal works like The Bathers, the portrait of his wife, Homage to El Greco. So obviously he raised it very, very highly. But again, it's these shows that happen that sort of help bring into the consciousness of people, of the British public, really. And ironically, the next slide though is of a show called The Other Story, which was curated by an artist called Rashid Arain. So in the late 1980s, in 1989 at the Hayward Gallery, and that was an exhibition that put together artists who had been, artists working in Britain from the sort of 1960s onwards, who had more or less been ignored by the establishment or by the major institutions. So even though all these artists were here working, producing some of their best work, had their best years here, there are no works in major British museums. And it took an awfully long time for the institutions to start realising that this was a massive hole in their collection. And so Rashid Arain, he was an engineer, came to London in the 1960s, and was a pioneer of minimalist sculpture. And again, and he published in a journal called The Third Text and Black Phoenix, and is a really important, influential figure. If any of you are down Bristol Way, in the next month or so, there's an exhibition at the RWA of his work that opened last week. There's a show in October in Cambridge that will open at the Moore Gallery. If anyone's up in Liverpool, there's a show up there at the moment. But what he did with this exhibition was to put a selection of artists' work together that was really sort of representative of the best of some of the best work from artists from Commonwealth or Commonwealth countries at the time. So on the right you've got Avinash Chandra, you can't really see it, and then Francis Newton Sousa. This is Rashid Arain's work on the left. He had the bars on the floor. There were similar sculptures placed on the roof of the Hayward Gallery, and controversially they disappeared after the exhibition, and it's thought that the builders didn't realise they were works of art and they went in the skip. So that was quite a long-running legal battle, which I don't really think ever had a happy ending. And then you have these are images of Ivan Peary's works, but you had artists like Gavin Jantiers, who has an exhibition coming up at the Whitechapel Gallery. Lubaina Himid was part of the show. David Madalla, Frank Bowling. Really very important. Mona Hatoum, really very important artists who had contributed, but who hadn't really been recognised. On the left here, the little wooden sculpture, the big little wooden sculpture, the large wooden sculpture, there's an artist called Ronald Moody from the Caribbean. He has a show opening, there's a retrospective show of his work at Hepworth Wakefield opening next month. And then on the right, you can see all the works by Ivan Peary's. And very sadly, he died just before this show opened. He died in 1988, and this opened the next year. But this exhibition is really considered a sort of, in hindsight now, because it was panned at the time in the press. Brian Sewell wrote a terrible comment about it. I think he said something like, the reason this exhibition is no good is because the artists are no good. And it's a comment that's not aged well. And but this exhibition is now considered a really key exhibition in the development of art in the UK in the late 20th century, because it was the first time that the public could go and see work by these artists in a museum, in the context that it deserved. So there are a lot of people looking back at this show now and sort of giving it, and it's getting the recognition and the praise that it deserves. And so many of those artists, I mentioned are household names now, but it's kind of high time that some of these other artists are sort of elevated as well.
The decolonizing agenda, and we need to decolonize science too, but it has got pieces into permanent collections, and I think that energy is stimulated, or certainly catalyzed what you're saying to happen. Yeah, and it's only the beginning, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a shame that the museums didn't buy the best that they could have done back in the day. Ironically, the Sousa right in that alleyway down the back, there's a large it's called Black Nude. That's in the V&A, and I was there the other week researching our next show, and I went into the storeroom, and it's hanging high up on the wall. It's absolutely massive. It's about 7-8 foot tall, and I've never seen it in person. It's just they've got it hanging in a back room, and it's just there, never really been shown. So there are these treasures there that are kind of just waiting to come out. But it's all about the curators now and about
that's something that people might want to discuss. There's a debate whether these things should be bought and put in permanent collections or not. And in Sri Lanka, there is a group that has the mentality or has the argument that these things should remain in Sri Lanka. I personally oppose that simply because even if they go and hang there, one of these days, everything in museums are going to be digitized, and we would have. Anybody could have access to these pieces in a kind of a database or some kind of way that everything is. So I think the more pieces go into permanent collections, the better. My argument, but people can debate this.
Yeah, so Shamil, we've got your conclusions out there.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think, just some of them were recognized and had honors. David Painter had got an OBE. George Keith was said to have declined an OBE, but I couldn't find any evidence anywhere about this, but maybe he did. Because in the younger days, he was part of a very, the 43 group, they were all part of a left-wing movement, and they were the kind of minority voice arguing for modernism, and the majority of the country wanted to go back to the glorious past. And 70 years on, people are now saying that countries that chose modernism at that period are much better off than the state that Sri Lanka is. And at least one presidential candidate is happy to say this publicly, that going back to the glorious past was a great mistake. So the 43 group represented an ideology that was advocating modernism, but they were an insignificant voice at the time. They advocated inclusivity, not just modernism. It was a lot of things that, unfortunately Sri Lanka didn't. In conclusion, I can't read that from there. So Sri Lankan modernism, I would say, that have had and continues to have an international perspective and are definitely shining beyond the shows. That's one of the themes that we, I think, developed during this discussion or seminar. Stimulated by the decolonizing movement, we covered that, but there is a lot of energy in the generating. For example, here in the UK, the Art South Asia project, I don't know whether there's anybody from ASAP, Grosvenor Gallery, Noble Sage Gallery, although Irina and Highgate Gallery was hosting George Claassen, and I hope you will host more Sri Lankan modernists in the future. And in Sri Lanka, I did just have to say something about the modern contemporary artists. Sri Lanka has reflected with an emerging, vibrant contemporary art scene over the past 10 to 15 years. The Saskia Fernando Gallery, ARTRA, Art Magazine, Colombo Scope, the Packet, a group of young artists. The Packet is like the 43 group of the 21st century, or this decade, I think, in the 20s rather. Establishment of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, MMCA, and most recently Kala, which aims to be an international platform, are some examples of the current scene. And there's real good work coming out of this. As Azara said, Sabamal Foundation, Barefoot Gallery, Gallery Cafe, and of course the National Gallery and the Lion and Went on, also to be acknowledged because they kept this art alive through very lean periods where there was no interest. So they have to be acknowledged. Finally, I would like to say much work is still to be done to establish the Sri Lankan modern artists or modernists in their rightful place in the world history of art. But that means inclusion in permanent connections, at the point I made, and galleries, books, proper archives, and there's a lot of material out there. It is not properly archived, we're going to lose it. And I think the film on George Claassen that's going to come out is also going to add to this kind of internationalization and recognition. Irina, do you want to say anything about film?
First of all, I just wanted to maybe add to what Charles said, and also
Shamil, to what you said about shining beyond beyond Sri Lankan shores here. So even when we go back to 1952, when there was the first exhibition of 43 group here in London at the Imperial Institute, we actually had that exhibition was supported by most of the well-established art critics at the time. And if you have a look at the, for example, the catalogue and the introduction to that exhibition, it was actually written by John Berger, who was one of the major art critics at the time. Also, an interesting point of fact is that I think, Charles, you mentioned an exhibition at the Heifer Gallery in Cambridge. I think that what people don't know is that the introduction, well, that exhibition held around 100 paintings by the 43 group, and that exhibition was introduced by Ian Foster, who is again one of the major writers, British writers at the time. So I guess my point is that there was a lot of attention given to the 43 group and the Sri Lankan modernism at the time. What I wanted to, I mean, I guess just to go back to the point you made about the film, I had a privilege to work with George Clason Estate, Esmeralda and Wolf, and also with Shamil, to put together a documentary that will be coming out. I mean, it's actually, the documentary was submitted to the BFI London Film Festival last week. It's also going to the Amsterdam Documentary Festival as well. And I hope that as many of you here will get a chance to see that film.
I don't have any more to add, I think, Azara.
I'd like to open the floor for any questions or any comments that would like to be shared.
Hi, Charlie, Azara and Cheryl, thanks so much for a wonderful and very informative talk. And I've got one question maybe and one point. Now, Azara was talking about modernism, the avant-garde nature of modernism, and that's something that really interests me. It is actually, by definition, a very an avant-garde idea that challenges social and cultural values. And I'm just curious how, when the 43 group, for example, came up with this work in Sri Lanka, the sort of social, the cultural impact it might have had at the time. And, you know, from my very specific UK kind of cultural perspective, I sort of imagine that it's a bit like what punk was like in the 70s.
Yeah,
You know,
great.
yeah.
It was a shock.
So, and you know, just talking to my wife Esmeralda, she told me this anecdote of how her dad took this painting to an exhibition on a rickshaw, and I think, was it the rickshaw driver or someone, came up to him and said, "How dare you paint your mother in this way?" You know, and he really took him to task. And it was a sort of major affront that this chap had painted in this manner. And I suppose we can't overestimate the cultural aspect of modernism. You know, it was such in Western society, so it must have been the same in Sri Lanka as well.
And most certainly, because in fact, many of the Harry Pirises at the Sapumal Foundation, I was told by Rohan that they were commissioned portraits of someone of their family, but then once they saw the end product, they did not like it because they didn't like the way in which the
They were
person
portraits,
was a portrait, so
it was
then they all
natural.
ended up
They
as
were all
some
used to the
artist.
classical.
Yeah.
The critics, those critics also slammed the critics for the establishment,
Right.
and they slammed the 43 first exhibition like it was all cheap imitations of
Right.
it could be.
But
yeah.
the
No, but then
idea.
again, I must make a note for Aubrey Collett, because he was very much a part of the narrative and the questions of the time, because we're looking at post-independence Sri Lanka, and that was a point at which there was a lot of turmoil also, especially with SWRD Bandaranaike's official language policy. And in fact, in this edition, Aubrey Collett had 7 prime ministers that he drew from the point at which...
Not flattering.
Yeah, not flattering at all, but it was very interesting because SWRD Bandaranaike is you have a disgruntled look, and then you have the sword, and it's very reflective of the consequence of the official language policy, because in his cartoon drawing on page 40, I believe, he depicts the leaving, the departure of the exodus of the Burger community as a result and consequence of this. So he was very critical of the rising living costs of the time. There was education policies. The CWW Kanagara implemented a free education. And in fact, at the launch of this edition of the magazine, we had Cressida Collett, who is the artist and daughter of Aubrey Collett, who also mentioned that he was finally, he was asked to leave. He was threatened by the state at the point. So he was someone who did challenge, and he was, yes, a punk, I believe, and more than that, an advocate, and someone who really is aligned with the consciousness of the people as well.
Yeah.
So,
But I think when many of these movements start, it's the same anywhere. You're talking to a very small room to begin with, and then you find people that align with your ideals and your principles, and then suddenly it grows, and then over time the radical becomes the normal,
Yeah.
and then you get
Yes.
the next
Another
wave
cycle.
after that.
Another cycle.
So,
And sorry, can I just follow up? The second question I wanted to ask is, do you think the 43 group, and I'm mentioning 43 group because they're the most high profile, do you think they are an influence to modern Sri Lankan artists in regard to joining the international conversation on art?
And to put that question to Sarath, I think, is a modern Sri Lankan artist. And there's another modern Sri Lankan artist here. So
I would imagine they cast a shadow, because it is the sort of first thing that most people talk about when you talk about Sri Lankan modernism. It's this group of artists, basically. In terms of having an influence, I can't say anything about that.
but I mean, I think the big hitters at the moment and international figures, Jagat Veer Singh, Chandragupta Tenwara, Mohanad Kader, they are, I think they have achieved in their lifetime.
yeah, I think every period has its own characteristics.
yeah.
So while the 43 group at present might seem like there was no relevance, they did present a revolt against the status quo, and now and with the contemporary Sri Lanka also went through a lot of stages at which we had the civil war, and the contemporary art, and especially the beginnings, were sort of coined by Jagat Veer Singh as a 90s trend, where there was a lot of grievances, a lot of critique against the civil war. So then there was so much, like this 43 group, I think the critical component came primarily from Aubrey Collett, but the contemporary art and the artists are digging far deeper into it. And even if you look at the economic crisis that we faced in the last few years, have been depicted very importantly by some of the artists, including Marco and Terry. So the climate has changed, and but in some sense I would say that maybe they may not be directly influenced by the 43 group, but the component of challenging, subverting is something that is being continuously taken on as an agenda.
I think as an artist who's been brought up in the UK, you're right, I think you do get influences, and even though seeing the work that I've seen by them, and yeah, in a way, in the back of your mind, you think, well, actually, where did I get that idea from? Where did that colour come from? And I guess it's part of it. You know, you cherish the things that are about yourself, and I guess that would be one of them. Yeah.
Sana put together the George Clason book, and I think you suffered a lot, so I'm glad that something has come out of that suffering. So, yeah. Late nights.
Late nights, yes.
I've got a question. Well, I don't know if it's a question or an observation, but there was some sort of discussion about countries that gained independence and finding identity through art and architecture, and kind of this uprising of doing something different to, you know, create their own voice. And modernism, as you said, sort of the time that it was in Western Europe. Minette de Silva was an interesting character for me, because I feel like she's just been sort of in the background. But she created so much architecture, and I didn't realise she was so involved in the art movement, and she was closely aligned with Corbusier. How much do you think this period was informed by independence? How much did art and architecture align with each other, and did they come up together, or was it, you know, sort of two things that were happening?
I think the most momentum conversation we were having.
But more than postman, I think during that period, I mean, David is here and Senator is here, we talk more for a minute, but I think, first of all, I think she's just been forgotten, erased, and rediscovered lately. But I think looking at her volume of work, she really expressed modernism in that period. You know, there was nobody else doing it, and she was like that Clason painting. You know, people might have been shocked with her creations because it was nothing like what they were trying to copy or imitate, or they were trying to imitate Western, I don't know, grand houses or what. But yeah, I mean, she really did. And the postmodernists like Bava and others came and just followed and then erased her out of the picture. But I mean, David, this I'm going into
I
your.
wouldn't say that's true.
No, I don't think so
But
that's true either.
they copied her.
No,
No,
that's not true either.
No,
I think that you can say that Bauer was influenced by Millet, but he certainly didn't copy from her. But I mean, I think the interesting thing about Millet, where you have to be very careful, is that yes, she came to England, she studied at the Architectural Association, and she was a friend of Le Corbusier. But as soon as she started practicing, she moved immediately away from a modernist position. And she wrote about it in Marg, and she coined the expression regionalism, critical regionalism. And her big idea, her contribution was not that she was a modernist, but that she sought to connect what she was doing with the context and with the tradition. And that in that way she was a regionalist. And it was through that she influenced Bauer.
And also I must add that there was almost like a renaissance in the 1960s as a result of Bauer, because he brings in Barbara, Lucky, Ismet Rahim, and then there are a lot of these properties across Sri Lanka that sort of gains momentum, and an intersection between art and architecture comes about very strongly, because if you look at some of the works of these artists, they do have a profound impact, because it was Lucky Senanayake was primarily given a lot of projects by Baba, so sometimes it's perceived as decorative, but if you look at the staircase across Jetwing Lighthouse, it's the depiction of the Portuguese versus Sri Lankan soldiers and his interpretation of death and decay, and then he went on to even design the currency notes, and that was a breaking point, because you had all the cultural buildings, and then there were indigenous.
But it's interesting that Lucky Senanayake was actually omitted from Seneca Vandanayake's book.
Those were the first book.
Yes.
didn't regard Lankan as an artist. He was regarded as a decorator, which is terrible. But I just wanted to say that, Minette, interestingly, Minette was a close friend of George Keat, and George Keat painted 2 murals for the first house that she designed. So that there was, and she also, through family, was connected with Lionel Went. So these people were all part of the same sort of circle and knew each other and were exchanging ideas.
Anuji, I don't know whether you want to add to this piece of conversation. Where that you also have
I do have to say, having written a very extensive book for the parish Lankan art, that it is very sad that people who didn't necessarily go through university, which the contemporary, if you look at Jagas and the people we're highlighting now, they're all at the university, so they've got huge access to budgets and opportunities to travel through scholarships. Whereas the 43 group really came out of a changing time and a feeling of confidence, because Sri Lanka is an amazing country and they felt confident to actually tell their stories. And I think this is a huge change for Sri Lanka. And I actually studied under people like Victor Bergen and John Purger, who you were mentioning just now, and they really, at university, really put forward the importance of Sri Lankan art. So I think the war as well, people travelled in the war, people experienced different countries, not in a great way, but this also made enormous interest because Sri Lanka suddenly became very much in people's minds, which is why when theatres were shut in the 50s, as you were talking about, there wasn't much going on, that lots of art was going on because people were now really interested because people knew about these countries, they knew about them, but they were talking about them. So suddenly this area really began to come up with people talking and a lot of politics going on as well. I mean, that's why I think it's interesting.
Your point is interesting because, I mean, the 43 group, let's face it, apart from 1 or 2, if not 1, they were all very privileged, came from very privileged background. Quite a few of them studied in the UK, so Cambridge, Slade, Chelsea, School of Art. So they studied here, then went back, and they brought that back. And also, what is most important is that Lionel Went again, who did he study at the Royal Academy? No, Royal Academy of Music. He studied that.
Yeah.
But he continued this. He used to
But
get
they chose
magazines.
to go back, that's my point. They chose to go back.
They chose to go back and revolutionize or bring something else. That is the point. But also, he had these magazines sent to him that he distributed to the 43 group, and that could have influenced or inspired them as well. So there was a kind of exchange, but they did go to university, some of them, but I think the poorest and the person who didn't fit in was Manjusri. He had, I don't think till he reached 30, he had any exposure to art, apart from temple paintings.
But Lucky also didn't go through the conventional route, and he's very political, and the work is extraordinary. To call him an artisan, as people get him, can't put him in an artwork. I was constantly told by academics in London, you cannot, he is not an artist, which to me was extraordinary, because that's a very political piece of the Lighthouse. It's not just a beautiful, it was originally a mural, but it was a very politicised look at what happened to Sri Lanka with the invasion.
And we didn't get a chance to mention Chekaru because where does he fit in and all that. There are lots of figures there that that can be. That's for another day.
And independence, as you mentioned, that is a key taper and an initial flame for so many of these developments. Especially in India, look at the Progressive Artists Group in Mumbai. Going from painting and drawing nudes and temple dancers and bullock carts and things like that in the British schools to then painting the reality of life on the streets of Mumbai, beggars with no arms, the poorest of the poor. That's these young artists expressing an identity that has previously just been snuffed out by British rule, basically, by colonialism. So it is absolutely, it's the oxygen that's needed to fan the fire, and in all these guys, artists, architects alike. I think
that was a period of change, and I think people are looking for this. But again, the progressive art movement was set. I mean, Yasodhara says that they were heavily influenced by the 43 group, since they came a little bit later. So yeah.
I think Eleanor Sniker is somebody you just have on the list, but she was so important in her knowledge, and I think so important, to get more from her.
Absolutely.
It's
Oh,
absolutely
totally.
her
Funny you
wealth.
should say that. I was saying, I
It-
want to
it-
make a
it-
pilgrimage
you
to
should
the
make-
US.
you should make- Well, I interviewed her for our book, and she extensively worked with me for months on it.
Right.
And it was eye-opening. In fact, she's one of the most impressive people I've ever learned from in the history of
I
art.
would love to meet her.
No, she's an amazing woman.
I think you've left it a bit late.
Yes.
She's now in a retirement home. She's not very well.
No, that's right.
She got her faculties,
Mm.
I hope. Memory.
And the
Well,
other one would
she
be
wrote
Mario
to me
Costello.
not long ago. I mean, I think her faculties are...
And Manel. Manel has to, I think we need to. There's so many things we could have done. Martin Russell, Siva and I, and another one of our friends, Koshins, for months and years probably saying we must go and video and tape record his anecdotes and stories, but we never got around to it. And I think Manel, we really need to.
Again, I think it's a bit probably too late, because I mean, Manel has been working on this Lionel Wendt
Yes.
book, and it's appeared in different forms, as catalogues and so on. But she's never completed it, and it's very sad.
Well, we are putting a lot of pressure on Manel to finish this book.
We'll get around to it.
Yeah, we are putting pressure on her, which is very heavily resisting, but
Yeah.
anyway. She needs to finish that book. Yeah, it really is going to be a very important book.
Right, I think any other questions?
Yes, maybe just a comment. I mean, another point is that, as we've already discussed, a lot of these artists were great characters. They had wonderful stories, and Irina's done a great job of documenting George's journey, and also some of his experiences, and they're all off the wall. And the personal histories are hugely interesting. As Charlie knows, I knew Susan very well. He used to live with us for a long time, and he was an amazing character, really. Always trying to get off with my mum, doing something, so that's another sort of discussion.
Don't get me going on creativity and mental illness.
That's a bit insulting. His mother was very beautiful.
No, but Susan was
It's pretty
exceptionally.
quite a healthy appetite, Susan, to put it like that.
Yeah.
And actually, someone told me that Ivan Peary's referred to it as a pimp with a palate. I've never heard it before, but yeah. So I think if there are any more questions, I think everyone's very happy to chat afterwards. But thank you both for making these plans and coming all this way.